Ladies, gentlemen, and otherwise, welcome. It has long been fabled that there exist creatures in the night, foul beasts that hide in the dark, lurking around every unseen corner of our world. Stories of apparitions rattling their chains in empty halls, of vampires feeding on the living in the dead of night, and of wolves that howl beneath the very moon that curses them. But friends, there exist much fouler beasts than monsters, and fiends more devilish than any ghoul. Imagine, if you dare, a creature with thin, withered skin stretched across mangled bone, eyes wide and blinking, yet strangely comforting to its prey, a gaping maw from which seeps the most potent of venoms, and a broken, disfigured voice that strikes fear into the hearts of the bravest soldiers. Tonight, my friends, we do not tell tales of beasts, no. Our story is a far more dreadful tale.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr., more commonly referred to as RFK Jr. or simply RFK, is an American lawyer, politician, and activist currently serving as Secretary of Health and Human Services for the United States government. I know most of you might just know him as the anti-vax guy with brainworms whose genes appear to be surgically attached to his body, but before he was a parody of his own political demographic, he actually had a career that wasn't completely insane. A member of the Kennedy political dynasty, RFK began his career as an environmental lawyer, fighting throughout the 80s and 90s for things like clean water and an end to corporate pollution. In fact, during that time, he joined two environmental nonprofits and even founded one called Waterkeeper Alliance, an umbrella organization that unites several different nonprofits focused on preserving natural bodies of water. And you might be thinking, wow, I didn't know that. That actually sounds kind of good. Well, don't get too excited just yet, because those are kind of the last things he did in his career that make literally any sense. Since around the mid-2000s, RFK has been one of the most prominent voices in the world promoting anti-science conspiracy theories, public health misinformation, and most notably, vaccine denialism. And let me tell you, this dude is basically the fucking LeBron of being a stupid piece of shit, okay? He has really done it all, folks. He did the chemtrails shtick when that was a thing. He did the poppers cause AIDS conspiracy back in the day. He even did the video games cause mass shootings meme.
Oh, the firearms question is a complex question. There could be connections with video games.
Throughout his career, there has been almost no conspiracy theory or alternative set of facts too silly for him to adopt into his poorly conceived rhetoric. Basically, if you can think of any false claim, just any claim that's obviously not true, there's a good chance that RFK has at some point dedicated his life and work to that exact topic. Like, if you told him that albatross venom causes shingles disease, he would probably instantly believe you and then spend 18 months parroting that exact claim both in the Roosevelt room of the White House and the fucking Joe Rogan Experience. And that doesn't even make sense. Albatrosses don't even have venom. They're just large birds. I made it up. And today, that guy, yes, that same guy that thinks Wi-Fi causes cancer and brain bleeding is now Secretary of Health and Human Services. You know, just one of the largest and most influential public health institutions in the world. And since then, he has continued his tirade of misinformation, no longer as just some guy, but from one of the most powerful positions in government, helping to blur the lines between what is authentic and helpful health advice and what's harmful misinformation designed to mislead the public. And the worst part is, it's It's working. Because of the rhetoric of RFK and people like him, there is now inarguably a sizable and growing number of people in this country who are not just casually skeptical of the facts, but proudly anti-science, who look down on peer-reviewed studies, criticize academic institutions, and react with hostility to seemingly any honest form of intellectual engagement. So the question is, what the fuck happened? How did we get here? How did tens of millions of people end up getting roped into an ideology or movement or whatever this is that openly rejects science, that's openly hostile to things like reasoning and evidence and intellectual curiosity? Well, to understand that, we need to look at RFK and the anti-science push in the context of broader culture and society. Because it's not just RFK who's participating in anti-science rhetoric and misinformation, right? He doesn't act alone, he acts within the context of a larger political administration, the Trump administration, an openly fascist one with its own political agenda. And I think that's the key to understanding what's going on here. On its own, the anti-science movement is little more than some people online trying and mostly failing to convince people that I don't know, the earth is flat or something. But now it's not just a loosely connected group of extremely online individuals anymore. It's a cultural movement, a political agenda. Make America healthy again. Maha, or Maha. Maha! The anti-science movement's proximity to and collaboration with the Trump administration, a political movement structured around power, institutional disruption, and systemic persecution of those deemed political enemies, seems to be the main tether to which the anti-science movement, as we will be calling it in this video, attaches itself. In other words, it's a mutually beneficial relationship, a symbiosis, if you will. As authoritarians, the Trump administration are extremely amenable to political forces that undermine faith and trust in institutions, demonize certain authority figures, and rile up supporters based on perceived grievances. And as insane, clout-driven grifters, RFK and the anti-science movement are given literally the largest megaphone that has ever existed in the world ever. So that's what we're going to be taking a look at today. In this video, we will be talking about how authoritarian political movements like the Trump administration with RFK undermine the very concept of truth. How they're not only able to contort reality itself to fit their objectives, but more importantly, how they get people invested, how they convince their supporters to relinquish their own intellectual faculties on behalf of an ideology. And for that, my friends, we will need to investigate what I call the epistemology of fascism. Stop! Before we get to that, I need to tell you guys something. I have a confession to make. I'm a streamer. That's right, baby. If you like my content and have ever thought to yourself, man, his content is good, but I just wish it was more regular, far less polished, and full of various expletives, then you're in luck. Yes, for the past few weeks, we have been hanging out on Twitch, twitch.tv/opinionatedlive, talking about politics, news, life, and basically just having a grand old time with chat. And if that sounds like something that you want to see, well, would you look at that? We do it at the same time every week. Wednesdays at 8 p.m. Wednesdays at 8 p.m. Wednesdays at 8 p.m.
Eastern Standard Time. Also, sometimes we do other days too.
So what are you doing? Go on and give me a follow on the purple side. Oh, and if you're not free on Wednesdays, by the way, don't worry. I made a clips channel just for you.
Yes, just for you, Nicholas. I made my clips channel for your eyes only. Come find me, Nicholas.
Links in description. And now back to the video. Epistemology, or the theory of knowledge, is a branch of philosophy that deals with how we intellectually differentiate between fact and opinion, and how we separate what we believe from what we know to be true. It's the main idea philosophers ponder when considering the concept of truth. How do you know when something is actually true, and what about that truth makes it different from just regular old belief? Well, if you can believe it, each ideology has its own unique approach to this question. Under a classically liberal framework, we have what's called empirics, where knowledge is arrived at through a process, one that involves things like observation, reasoning, and deduction. This is also commonly referred to as the scientific method, a materialist worldview that necessitates an evidentiary standard as a prerequisite for belief. Basically, our entire modern world is built on this process, from medicine to transportation to housing to the latest iPhone, now made with less iPhone. But even simpler forms of this exist in day-to-day life. Every day we gather information, make observations, and try to align our worldview as closely with reality as possible. For example, if you get home and you see your family member's car in the driveway, you can reasonably assume that they're home without actually having to physically see them in the house. That's an example of knowledge derived from the process of observation and reasoning, and empirical deduction. And when this process is applied to sociology, it's called rationalism, or empirical epistemology. But the most important thing to know about rationalism is that at its core is the idea that knowledge is a human construct. Empiricists operate on the principle that truth, as we perceive it, is fluid and dependent on us, evolving based on the progression of human discovery and molded by human perception. Essentially, knowledge, or what we know to be true, isn't a property of the world, but a property of us having interpreted the world. And without us, truth would cease to exist, as it is a construct that has value only to humans. But even though this might seem obvious and intuitive, like, yeah, you should only believe stuff if there's evidence for it, duh, this is not the only known approach to the theory of knowledge. Fascists, for example, approach it a bit differently. Underscoring the fascist worldview, as you may have seen it displayed in their politics, is the idea that the universe possesses a fixed, unchangeable, natural order, that it operates governed by a strict set of universal laws, and that therefore truth and knowledge exist outside of humans, subsisting whether or not humans are around to perceive them. It follows then that knowledge must not be a human construct, but instead something external that humans are merely granted access to. We don't make knowledge, knowledge is revealed to us. This is the essential distinction between liberal and fascist epistemology, where empiricists arrive at and construct knowledge through an intellectual process. Fascists possess it as an attribute. Under a fascist framework, it isn't observation and deduction that lead to truth. Knowledge isn't derived through reason, but is bestowed upon you by an outside force, whether that be the state or a leader or nature itself. And this approach to knowledge is often extremely useful to them. The myth of the natural order, or the idea that the universe has one objective fixed state, is the ideological tentpole to which fascists tether their more unjustifiable beliefs. It is an epistemic rationalization for a belief in the irrational, like racial supremacy, or patriarchy, or homophobia, or transphobia. These things are all permitted by a first principle that basically boils down to the world is objectively a certain way, and it ought to be. Fascists commonly justify bigotry, exclusion, and subjugation with the claim that they're simply adhering to the ways the world naturally is. They aren't personally sexist, men and women are just fundamentally different. They aren't doing segregationism, they're preserving nature's naturally drawn racial boundaries. The consequences of this pattern of thinking are obvious. If truth isn't a human construct and is instead something that has always existed and always will, regardless of human impact, then the tools that we use to test and refine our knowledge suddenly become obsolete. If truth is not a human creation, then things like observation, experimentation, and rationalism are at best a redundancy to the truth, and at worst, a threat to it. Because the fascists, not only are empiricism and the scientific method largely irrelevant to how knowledge is gathered, but they're seen as a subversion of a predetermined truth, a heresy against the laws of the universe. And that's kind of a great parallel to things we're seeing in modern politics, right? In fact, the RFK-led anti-science movement does exactly this. Core to the rhetoric of his agenda is seemingly the claim that natural is always better. The things like vaccines or GMOs or certain life-saving medications should be taken only as a last resort, if at all, because they're in conflict with how the human body is naturally supposed to work.
I was talking with my staff about these petroleum-based dyes, and I said if they want to add petroleum, they want to eat petroleum, they ought to add it themselves at home.
And make no mistake, this, although often dressed up in modern lingo and internet jargon, is an appeal to the natural order. It is fundamentally a claim that new discoveries in health sciences and nutrition are a subversion from what nature intends, that new medicines, potentially even those which are life-saving, are a betrayal of your own health in the long run because your body has and does everything you need to survive. But that still doesn't answer the question, why? Why do they repeat these claims even though they're, one, wrong, and two, actively harmful to public health? You know, the institution they were hired to manage? Why do they insist on being verifiably incorrect all the time at the expense of their own credibility and influence? Well, simple. It's useful to them politically to do so. You see, fascists aren't constantly wrong because they're just out of touch with reality or exceedingly stupid, although in many cases they are. They're constantly wrong primarily as a deliberate tactic to destabilize one of the key elements of a functioning democracy, which is a shared, agreed-upon reality. The more consistently and enthusiastically they can construct a fake reality made up of fake facts, the more they can untether people from the constricting binds of having to believe stuff that's true. And in so doing, they're able to create an in-group, out-group dynamic, a system of exclusion, this time not along gender or racial lines, but informational lines, one in which each group possesses their own version of reality, their own set of the facts, incapable of convincing or sometimes even reaching the other side. And that's not even the whole of it either. There are systemic consequences to this that authoritarians love to exploit. Each time RFK or Stephen Miller or even Trump himself repeat a wildly false claim that is, let's be real, instantly disprovable, they aren't just reinforcing an in-group worldview to their base, they're also casting aspersions onto nearly every trusted, long-standing institution that would have the potential to disrupt their agenda. When fascists lie constantly and are basically allowed to do so publicly for over 10 years with little to no consequences, it has a chilling effect on the ability of institutions whose authority comes from empiricism to dispel their narratives. In other words, with each lie the fascist tells, the truth has just a tiny bit less power, slowly being eroded away until a critical mass of this country literally believes that the Jews have a big weather machine that they use almost exclusively to just basically nuke Florida 50 times a year. And this alternate reality complex that most of the modern right suffers from now also serves to bolster certain go-to conspiracy narratives as well, another critical element of fascist rhetoric. They say false things on purpose, hoping that respected and venerated institutions will go, actually, and correct them, so they can use that correction as a confirmation that the truth is being hidden, or that they're being silenced for their beliefs. Lies as a galvanizing force against the truth. So in this way, the knowingly false claims they constantly make are a tool they can use against establishment power, a wedge which they can use to pry open the average American's faith in things like the law, academia, the Constitution, education, elections, public health, and every other institution that would be theoretically opposed to an authoritarian lunge for power. And it's no coincidence either that all of the institutions I just mentioned have in some way already been undermined by the Trump administration. It is a concerted, highly organized destabilization effort. And when these institutions and traditions are destabilized effectively enough, they make said institutions functionally irrelevant to the discourse, and the leaders themselves become the sole arbiter of truth, the source of all true knowledge, single-handedly choosing what's truth and what's fake news, who to listen to and who not to listen to, who to see as a human being and who to see as an enemy. And as public faith in not just institutions, but truth in general is undermined, they make themselves accountable to no force other than themselves, constructing a political arena in which they are the player and the referee. And once that public trust is gone, once people have no faith left in truth or law or justice, that's when they can really begin. That's when they have the license to correct any fact, revoke any law, and undermine any fundamental right. It is simultaneously the final nail in the coffin of democracy and the nascent first step of a fully fledged authoritarian regime. But hold on, before we get ahead of ourselves here, there's still something that isn't adding up, something that doesn't quite make sense. I mean, sure, authoritarian leaders like to control the narrative and will lie openly because it's better to control a fake reality than to submit to the real one. That much is clear. But what's not clear is how once you've abandoned the concept of evidence, once you've thrown in the towel on convincing people through empirical reasoning, well, how do you get them on your side now? I mean, we know why the leaders do what they do, but what about the followers? What compels them to join these movements, to cheer them on and defend them, especially if they're not even based on anything? I think we need to go deeper. So, we've covered the supply side of the whole fascist anti-science movement in this country, right? Why these leaders and prominent figures do what they do, but what about the demand side? What about the reasons normal, everyday people are willing to join these movements? Because when it comes to ideology, sure, you can be selling, but that doesn't mean people are buying. At the end of the day, a movement is about getting people on your side. So, what's the appeal? Because it certainly seems like a lot to ask of people, right? Hey, come join me in my ideology where we can't trust evidence and science. That's hardly an enticing pitch. So besides an alternative, unsubstantiated set of facts, what does the anti-science movement offer people? Well, I think it's probably best if we look at an example. And there are many examples of RFK in particular making false claims for what seems like the hell of it. We could look at when he said fluoride in water causes IQ loss and bone cancer, or when he said COVID-19 is targeted to attack Caucasians and black people specifically, or that time in 2019 when he traveled to Samoa to discourage people from taking the measles vaccine, which in turn caused an outbreak that needlessly took the lives of 83 people, most of whom were children. But I want to focus on something more prescient in discourse, something that's been around for a while, and that is in fact one of RFK's main concerns as HHS secretary. And that is the claim that vaccines are linked to autism spectrum disorder. Now, this is a claim that's been around for a while, since 1998, in fact, when a group of lawyers got together and paid a physician named Andrew Wakefield to publish a fraudulent study in The Lancet establishing a causal link between MMR vaccines and autism. Also, said lawyers could then go after big vaccine manufacturers. But although this claim has been around for a long time, it's been debunked for almost as long, over 2 decades, in fact. And guys, let me tell you, if there's one thing RFK Jr. loves, it's repeating this claim over and over. RFK Jr. has either implied or directly stated this claim several times, not just since he's been politically active, but even since he was confirmed as HHS secretary. Here's him in April suggesting that autism is caused by, quote, an environmental toxin. Here's him in June calling for the retraction of a study that found no link between vaccines and chronic diseases in children. And here's him blaming the parents of autistic children for their condition, saying, we have to recognize we are doing this to our children. Even at his own confirmation hearing, after being confronted on this issue and refusing to deny the claim, he stated there are, quote, other studies out there suggesting a link between vaccines and autism. And just to reiterate, this is, and I can't understate this, complete bullshit. There has never been an associated link between vaccines and autism, or really any scientific evidence whatsoever to suggest it. The theory has been as debunked as a theory can be for decades, and has literally never once survived even the slightest academic scrutiny, being repeatedly proven incorrect with every new study that comes out on it. It just isn't true, and RFK knows it. But the question isn't why is RFK lying about it? We know why he's lying about it. He repeats false claims as a part of the Trump administration's larger goal to undermine public faith in truth and democracy. The question is, why do the people believe it, even though a quick 15 seconds on Google.com completely shatters the idea? And not to do that thing where you split up a video that's already in sections into even smaller, shorter subsections, but the answer to this is threefold. 1. An answer. While we definitely know that autism isn't caused by vaccines or whatever, it remains the case that autism isn't completely understood by science. It's an incredibly complex condition with incredibly complex origins, and the idea of vaccines, a foreign substance you inject mainly into children, being that origin is emotionally compelling enough for some people that evidence isn't even a requirement for them to adopt the belief. And sometimes that's all you need. Sometimes it doesn't matter how much evidence there is to the contrary, or how many peer-reviewed studies come out against it. People just want satisfying answers, even if those answers are wrong. And if science doesn't have a clear enough or concise enough explanation for something, then an authority figure who claims he has all the answers can be quite alluring, because at the end of the day, trust is easier than reasoning. It is easier to have faith in an idea than it is to empirically verify it, or comprehend the study that proves it, or weigh all of the evidence yourself and make an informed conclusion. And that's kind of the thing, right? In many ways, the anti-science movement is similar to a faith or spiritual tradition and has a lot of the same core functions. Where empiricism necessitates things like doubt and uncertainty as components of truth, faith provides certainty, clarity, and stability. It provides a way for people to make sense of the world without having to do the work of figuring it out. A set of ideas that don't need to be verified empirically because they already make sense intrinsically. This is why you'll see a lot of right-wingers call their incoherent beliefs something like common sense in a way that seems to affirm their own contradiction to evidence, like they know that they're not even making sense. Who needs evidence and all that science mumbo-jumbo when you have common sense? I just tell it like it is. I don't need science to back me up. These are both adages that express an enthusiastic willingness to abandon the uncertainty and humility of scientific reasoning for the comfort and convenience of dogma. 2. A narrative. When you don't have a solid empirical ground for the things you believe, when evidence is not a criterion by which you judge whether something is true, the question arises, what do you replace that with? How do you judge whether to believe something or not? Well, as we've discussed at length, fascists fundamentally reject empiricism as the foundation of truth, instead preferring appeals to things like emotional resonance or adherence to a given narrative as the criteria for adopting a particular belief. If a claim just feels true or fits in nicely with a political narrative they happen to already hold, it's often accepted regardless of its veracity. And we see this with vaccines and autism. At the core of this claim lies two stories, two narratives. One in which pharmaceutical companies plot to poison your children, academic institutions cover it up, and only the right strongman can come along to fix all of it. And another, where the autism itself is framed as an unnatural, corrupting force, a thing that must be eliminated from the world. These two narratives are mutually reinforcing. The elite corporate conspiracy provides the how, the mechanisms by which the plot against you is being orchestrated, while the myth of the corruption provides the call to action, the justification for why it must be resisted. These types of narratives are present in almost all right-wing beliefs that have no basis in empiricism because they all share that allusion to the concept of the natural order. To a fascist, or pretty much any ableist for that matter, autism is a disease with a fixed cause that can and should be corrected. They do not consider the possibility that autism simply exists in people or that it can even be a natural default state. No, it is seen as an illness, a consequence of some external factor, a deviation from the natural order. To them, autism is unnatural, and therefore its origins must be as well. So we can take from that the natural order heuristic isn't merely a political opinion or philosophical belief. It's a story, a central narrative to which they can tie pretty much any political prescription, painting bigotry and anti-science rhetoric as a grand pursuit against perceived injustice. This is why fascists always seem like they think the world is ending, even in response to the most trivial events. Because to them, no action or event can exist simply on its own. And nothing ever happens in a vacuum. Everything is always in the context of a narrative with existential implications. It is a lens by which every action, political or otherwise, can be framed as either a submission to or an attack against the will of the universe. It's pretty heavy stuff. And this not only gives them a direction to point their anger in, but a feeling of righteousness that they, by being weird about trans people or something, are helping facilitate the machinations of the universe. Which brings me to 3, a purpose. If there's one thing that everyone knows about fascists, it's that they're all fucking losers. The vast majority of them are deeply insecure LARPers with, let's be real, either a humiliation fetish or an extremely high tolerance to cringe, and the rest are what can at best be described as, virgins. But really though, fascism is a fundamentally insecure and isolating ideology. In fact, those are kind of the main pillars of it, as it's based almost solely on principles of exclusion and eternal victimhood. And what fascist ideology so conveniently does is utilize that isolation and insecurity as the very foundation for the ideology itself. You see, baked into fascist thought is the concept of exclusivity. The idea that only a select group of people are allowed into the fold, only a select set of ideas permitted in the conversation. And unlike most other ideologies who coalition build based on who they can take in, fascists build their base according to who they can keep out. This is what makes fascism unique. It's basically the only ideology where the in-group is almost exclusively defined by who and what constitutes the out-group. Because we're sure other movements might have in-group, out-group dynamics or have some level of exclusivity, it's usually the case that those things are done in pursuit of a larger goal, a secondary measure to accomplish a more primary concern. I want better housing policy, therefore I won't work with landlords. I want better labor rights, so I won't work with scabs, etc. Usually the ideology comes first and the in-group, out-group dynamic second, as a means to achieve a given end. But in the case of fascism, the ideology is the in-group, out-group dynamic. It's not a means to an end, it is the end. The exclusion is the point, which inevitably ties the act of rejecting unworthy outsiders to the feeling of belonging and community derived from being in a select in-group. By defining who the group is that you are going to systematically exclude and subsequently persecute, let's not forget, you're confirming your own place in the in-group and contributing to a shared community ethos. And this dynamic is what makes the conspiracy and anti-science narratives so popular, because when an authority figure makes an outrageous anti-scientific claim to the public, they aren't just providing their base with an alternative set of facts, they're also drawing a line in the sand between insiders and outsiders of a coalition. When RFK Jr. says some obviously false shit like synthetic food dyes cause ADHD, he isn't just giving his base another wrong thing to believe, he's giving them another opportunity to reaffirm the ideological boundaries between them and those they see as political opposition. In this way, possessing an alternative set of facts isn't even about what's true and not true, really. In reality, it's about belonging. It's about signaling your loyalty to an in-group, no matter the intellectual or moral cost. And that's why the claims they make are so often so transparently false, right? Because they could have gone down the road of making their bullshit less obvious and slightly more believable. But they didn't. Because the more insane the claims are, the more that it means to devote oneself to it. The more stupid the things that you believe are, the more loyal you show yourself to be, the more of a true patriot you become. This is why the modern right comes off as so fervent in their devotion to their cause, because by repeating all of the stuff they hear on Fox or from the Trump administration, they are, yes, being loudly wrong and annoying, but more importantly, they're virtue signaling, showing everyone else that they're a part of the in-crowd, that they know what the in-group line is, and that they're willing to stick to it. They attack the media and education and public health and the law, not only because they believe the stuff they're saying, but also because it brings them meaning and purpose. When you attack nearly every public institution that you yourself benefit from, you aren't just doing advocacy, right? You're fighting a freaking epic bacon battle against evildoers and securing your place in a community of like-minded individuals. This, at the end of the day, is the main reason why conservatives are so willing these days to throw aside any intellectual curiosity, skepticism, or reasoning skills that they might possess in favor of an ideology that doesn't even bother with making sense. Because sure, if you're someone who cares about empirical fact and the scientific method, yeah, you might have the truth on your side and be right more often, but it'll be boring. You won't get to feel cool. You won't get to feel like a warrior. You won't get to feel like you're part of a special club with all the secrets. You'll be boring. And anything, even fascism, is better than being boring. It is not, nor has it ever been, clear if RFK Jr. is a malicious actor preying on people's lack of knowledge about health to manufacture outrage as fuel for his own career, or if he's simply a fucking idiot. But idiot or not, he has a very valuable purpose to very powerful people, which is that his rhetoric, whether intentional or not, is extremely useful to those who would seek to undermine public trust in science, or law, or community, or even democracy itself. And sure, he's not the only one. There are many people, many influential people, working really hard right now to break down every last structural pillar of civil society, the institutions and core values that prevent authoritarians from seizing power. And RFK certainly has his role in that. But more importantly, his actions and beliefs are simultaneously the contributing factors and the end result of a far larger, far more corrosive social force. People are more isolated now than ever before, and as a consequence, they're less community-oriented than the generations that came before them. And they're also more hopeless than ever before. They can't afford rent or groceries. They don't see a viable path for growth in their careers. They don't even have a third place they can go to meet people and interact with strangers and have fun or fall in love. And in that hopelessness and uncertainty, people naturally seek comfort and a sense of order, a way to interpret the world that is easy to understand, emotionally satisfying, and most importantly, actionable. And that is, I think, where the anti-science movement gets most of its power from. You know, a little while ago, I made a video about debate and the Overton window. Click the card to watch, make sure to like and subscribe and ring the bell. And in that video, I said, we shouldn't waste our time debating fascists and Nazis on their ideas because they're not actually interested in the truth. And in that same video, I also said that we need to effectively and actively combat those same groups, or we risk them infiltrating public life and making everything worse for everyone. And since I uploaded that video, again, click the card, ring the bell, and sign up to the Patreon, many people have pointed out to me that this feels like a contradiction. That on one hand, I'm saying we should fight back, and on the other, I'm saying that we shouldn't bother. And I think RFK Jr. and the anti-science movement is a perfect example to illustrate what I mean, and why what might seem like a contradiction is actually, I think, the only way forward. I think it's clear, almost self-evident, in fact, that people like RFK or the people that believe him are not worth being debated, really. I think we're honestly way far past the idea that these people can be moved over just from appealing to logic and reasoning alone. But just because it's often fruitless to try and debate these people out of their positions or convince them otherwise doesn't mean that there's no way to effectively fight back against these groups. Now, I think a lot of times people make the mistake of assuming that when the right makes gains in culture, that it's on ideological grounds, that they are quote-unquote winning the argument, that they're making their case better than us in the marketplace of ideas. When in actuality, as we see with RFK Jr., it's not really about the ideas themselves, is it? Time and time again, we've been shown that what the actual claims are doesn't really seem to matter at all. RFK or Trump or whoever could get on the podium and say just about anything, and the effect that they have on their base would be the same every time. And that's because the right's power doesn't come from their ideas. It comes from their ability to maneuver socially and culturally, to capture attention, to appeal to things other than pure intellect, to exploit raw emotion and cultural grievance to build a movement. The reason the right is so easily able to abandon things like evidence and critical thinking is because they've invested billions of dollars into think tanks and pundits and lobbyists, and have strengthened their grip on culture to such an extent that intellectual accountability is kind of no longer necessary. In other words, because the right-wing media machine works so well, it no longer matters what the claims they're making are, so long as the people watching know what side they're on and who their enemies are. So therefore, when liberals debate them or try and defeat them on ideological grounds, they're falling for a trap that was laid in advance that causes them to waste their time and energy on a foregone conclusion. In truth, the battles that the left should be fighting aren't intellectual or ideological ones, but social and cultural ones. Because while yes, fascists inherently don't believe in truth or debate, they do believe in power. They do believe in social capital, and those are the things that they're good at getting. Controlling discourse, manufacturing outrage, selling a message. That is what the left needs to spend our time pursuing. That's where our energy should go. Not spending 4 hours picking apart an obviously false claim that the fascist will instantly drop anyway the moment it's convenient. The real battles to be had are in culture. The real fights worth fighting are social ones. We should be willing to identify our enemies and make social life practically impossible for these freak weirdos and their freak weirdo beliefs. I mean, shit, just 10 years ago, it was socially unthinkable to be an open white nationalist. Now it's a mainstream position. And that's not because the left didn't argue well enough. It's because we allowed them to more easily make cultural gains. So our focus shouldn't be proving that people like RFK and Trump are technically incorrect. That should be apparent to anyone who actually pays attention to anything. No, our greater concern is beating them at their own game. Not defeating them intellectually, but making them socially obsolete. Building a coalition that makes politics of fear, anger, and resentment impossible. Building a future based on hope and a desire to change the world and make it better. Because something we have that people like RFK and Donald Trump will never have, besides obviously a coherent worldview and an internally consistent set of facts, is hope. A desire to see the world change for the better, rather than a belief that the world will always be a certain way. A worldview built around community and compassion rather than around exclusion and fear. And to do that, it requires conviction and passion, not just a broad knowledge of the facts. We need to ruthlessly defend our communities, not just prove their attackers wrong. We need to make life unlivable for people who want to make our lives unlivable, and make socializing unworkable for those with antisocial beliefs. Because compassion and community aren't just things that exist that will always exist. There will always be people who want to destroy those things, and they will try to do so with words, with money, and even with violence. And if that's the case, it's time we start realizing that these things that we hold so dear, the threads that make up the very fabric of our society, truth, love, democracy, they aren't inherent properties of humanity that will always be there. They're things worth fighting for.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one, even with all the
wardrobe. It's getting kind of close to spooky day, so I wanted to dress up a bit. Sue me. But yeah, if you like this video and you like my content and you want to see more of me than just once every month or two, I stream every week on Twitch. I would love to see some of you there, so Wednesdays at 8 p.m, come hang out. I'd love to have you. I will leave all my links in the description for other places you can find me, and yeah, thank you so much again for watching. Bye.